What's up, everyone on the World Wide Web? My name is Jesse, and this is Riley, and today we are talking about the difference between myth and fantasy and what is the origin of the modern fantasy.
Yep. Happy 4th of July, everyone, by the way. I feel terrible because I came here and Jesse was rocking the red, white, and blue, and I'm like, I didn't even think about that. I'm in green, so you'll have to apologize my shirt choice here. But yeah, I was excited when we thought about this idea of what makes fantasy and what makes mythology, how they're related. And so I think it'd be, let's just start right off and get into the discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. So, modern fantasy. That's the end goal. That's what we want to explain. But how did we get there? Like, how did we get Tolkien? How did we get Mistborn? How did we get these modern fantasies? And where did they come from? So, ultimately, I think, according to my research, it started with myths.
Yeah, I feel like, most of you, if you've had a somewhat similar journey to myself, you grew up hearing or reading fantasy and fell in love with the world of fantasy, this idea of there being a much more beautiful and fantastic world than what we have currently in our modern world. And that was one of the, that escapism was one of the reasons why we fell in love with the works of fantasy in writing and in movie, any kind of story that has to do with fantasy. And I grew up thinking that a lot of these things that J.K. Rowling and J.R.R. Tolkien had used were completely made up by them. And I definitely thought that they must have had just an amazing imagination that was so beyond my own. And as I grew up and I did more research, I came to realize that a lot of the inspiration that was that is manifest in those movies and books comes from mythology. It comes from stories that were already around, or concepts that had already been created by the ancestors of humankind for years and years beforehand, and they were able to. I'm not trying to discredit any of the fantasy authors out there. They're amazing, but they're able to take a lot of those elements and include them into their story, and then yes, possibly make up some of their very own unique ways of looking at it with a twist, or even creating things out of full cloth. Yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the base things, like before stories, before fantasy, I think there was superstition or sorry, bear with me, religion. So that has to do with a belief in the supernatural.
Yeah.
So not understanding the world. So imagine like these people, they haven't discovered, they haven't created fantasy, obviously, and they're telling each other stories about what happened back at the last campsite, or they're doing cave paintings, and they're telling stories about what happened, and then they run into something they don't understand, and they make something up, or they think that I think panthers can scream like a woman, right? So they hear that scream,
Yeah.
and then they think it's something else.
Yeah, it's all of what mythology is from the research that I've done, similar to what you said, is it's a way to explain the world around you that you don't understand. Mythology was both religion and science for the ancients, because without knowledge of how things actually work, for example, the idea of salamanders being fiery, like I always wondered why a lot of times I'd read or seen in movies, like for example in Frozen, Frozen 2, yeah, you've got the little fiery lizard, the little salamander there. That was like the second or third time in my life that I'd seen that depicted as salamanders having to do with fire, and I was like, why is that? Why do we always associate that? And I did some research, and apparently it is because when the ancients would burn logs, the salamanders that were living in the logs at the time would come out of the fire to
No
escape
way.
there. Yeah, yeah, and we didn't know that. They always assumed that they had come created from the fire itself. They had no idea that a salamander could live in a log.
Oh, wow.
And so they always thought that when you made fire with certain kinds of woods or properties, that it created these beings called fire salamanders. Yeah, like
Wow, that's really
right.
fascinating.
And so it's like mythology is like it's it is the most creative way that a human being could come up with an explanation for something that they
Yeah.
didn't entirely understand.
That is so fascinating.
Yeah.
I learned something today. So we have these myths and these like interactions with nature, right? And then they start making stories. And then what happens is they start stringing those events together in a story. So that would be, so you get the myths of Greek mythology. So you have Zeus, Dionysus, all these Greek gods. Actually, all these Egyptian gods. Like they have stories a lot behind a lot of these, and then they start stringing them together. And one of the biggest, I think, the first fantasy novel ever was Homer's Odyssey. Like that was the first modern
Yeah,
fantasy. I mean, it's obviously
that was at least put to paper.
that was put to paper exactly. And then things evolve. We get to Roman and Greek times, where you have these stories become more solid, and there's actually like canon because they're religion, right?
Yeah. And are we referring right now to mostly Western society, or does that include Eastern society as well?
I don't
Because-
know a whole lot about Eastern society,
Yeah.
so if you have
And-
any insights on that.
No, to be honest, I don't really do. I haven't. Most of my research when it has to do with mythology and fantasy comes from a Western view of looking at things and the history of Western society going back, like you said, to Greek mythology. But to be honest, like as far as if we're talking about fantasy, the genre in the way that it is now, involving like if you're thinking of Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter, then it definitely has more of a Western societal background to it, much more than an Eastern one, because a lot of those places or a lot of these movies and ideas take place in a Western society, Europe, specifically Northwestern Europe, like.
Yeah.
I think J.R. Tolkien and J.K. Rowling both have influences of Norse mythology, Celtic mythology, Greek mythology. Like,
I mean, J.K. Rowling's magic system in Harry Potter is Latin.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's definitely if we're going to be discussing where our modern fantasy comes from, then we're going to be focusing mostly on those parts.
Ourselves. I mean, because I'm not really much into the Eastern society. If you are, leave a comment below and like share some of your knowledge with us.
Yeah, please. And I'm sure that there are, especially in a lot of other modern fantasies that I'm unaware of, there are going to be much more of those Eastern influences. But for now, we're going to be focusing mostly on what was happening in the Western Hemisphere.
Absolutely. So you have the myths. You have myths from Norse mythology. You have Thor and Odin, right? Okay, so now along comes the 1900s, and a guy last name Tolkien, he starts writing, right? He starts having experiences with the myths, right? And then he starts writing, and he starts writing the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit.
Yeah, so really, if you're going to look at pretty much anything that has to do with what we think of as modern fantasy, if it's a video game like World of Warcraft, or if it's another awesome movies and films like the Harry Potter or Percy Jackson, or even Dungeons and Dragons as a game, all of that you'll find pretty much some of a basis in J.R.R. Tolkien's works, a lot, and he has his basis in mythology, and his whole purpose was to sort of create a mythology for England, because here's a little history lesson here for everyone. England, what is now considered England, that section of Great Britain, at one point was inhabited by Celtic peoples, who you will now find mostly in the countries of Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. But when Rome, who was occupying Great Britain at the time, left, a group of tribal peoples called the Anglo-Saxons, who had come from what is now southern Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands, had come to England. And these Germanic peoples had their own myths that were pretty much the Norse mythology. Some of the names were different, like Odin was Woden. That's where we get the word Wednesday from, Woden's Day. Or Thor was Thur, so we have Thursday. These Anglo-Saxon peoples created their, they took over what is now mostly England, and with time they became Christian. And then with even more time, William the Conqueror from France came and at the Battle of Hastings took over England, and the French culture altered a lot of what we know as England. And Tolkien saw that as a tragedy because he had a passion for Anglo-Saxon culture. He was a professor of Anglo-Saxon at Oxford, and so his goal was to sort of reinvent or recreate sort of an alternate mythology to sort of replace what had been lost with all of what had happened. And so he drew very heavily from Norse mythology with, and this is up for debate, but some Celtic mythology as well, to sort of create this idea of what we now know as Middle Earth and, the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, the Silmarillion, and that is where we get a lot, if not almost all, of our modern fantasy from, is his sort of idea of this fantasy world with dragons and elves and dwarves, which almost all of that you can find in Norse mythology.
Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, what's the difference between myth and fantasy?
Good question.
So according to my research, I've done some research.
Yeah.
According to the internet, there's 3 criteria. Okay, there is number 1, the story is told as from a separate reality or a separate world. So the Lord of the Rings didn't happen on Earth; it happened in Middle Earth. Percy Jackson happened in that universe, not our universe, if that makes sense. So it happened in a different place. The second is related and very similar. The second criteria is it's fake. People know that this is a work of fiction, as opposed to rumors before that people believed, like honestly believed. Like, salamanders are fire creatures.
That was something that was genuinely believed for a while.
Right. So that's the idea. Is it's that it's fake. You know that it's a fictitious work.
Yeah.
And the number 3, the third criteria, is it is written by a specific author or authors. So, who came up with the idea that salamanders were fire creatures?
We don't know. There wasn't anyone who's penned, there's no little trademark symbol that says, I came up with this, I am George of the, first century. Like
Right. So there's like, they're rumors, they're just thoughts that there's no actual person put down that on, like, oh, I discovered this, I created this story.
They were just sort of a conglomerate of ideas and ways of viewing the world that were kind of made by people and then generally accepted by the public.
And on the opposite side of that, you have Lord of the Rings, which is specifically written by J.R.R. Tolkien, and then Harry Potter was written by
J.K. Rowling. Everyone knows those names are synonymous with that idea. Yeah.
Exactly. So those are the 3 things that separate, the main 3 things that separate mythology from fantasy. Everything else is basically a free game.
Yeah. And that's why they were able to draw on those ideas. For example, I was telling Jesse this beforehand. Some people might look at Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit and see like, oh wow, like the trolls turn to stone in the sunlight. That's a pretty unique concept. That's so cool that J.R.R. Tolkien made that up. And in reality, he didn't make that up. That is something that comes right out of Norse mythology. And to this day, in Scandinavia, you can find giant rock trolls that people have carved to honor that tradition, and you can see them. They're these goofy looking, like, just you can tell they're like trolls or ogres or something like that, and they're pretty big, and they're just carved out of rock, and you know, stuff that they can tell their kids growing up, like, yeah, these are real trolls they got in the sunlight.
Watch out for trolls.
Yeah, you don't want to be wandering around at night because trolls will get you. You know, it was a way to sort of, so many different ways of or reasons why you would have myth to give to people. Sometimes it was for purely entertainment's sake, but sometimes it was to keep kids safe. Sometimes it was, you know, all of these different things. Like, why do we tell our kids Santa Claus exists? Like, it's for fun. It's for the entertainment of it. It's to create this sort of sense of magic in them, to help them see that the world really, truly is amazing. Like,
and rewards good behavior.
Rewards good behavior, and, you know, Santa's watching you, so don't be bad. You know, it's like, it helps you as a parent, like, I'm not a parent, but I would guess that my parents, you know, hopefully avoided me being a brat at some points because they told me that Santa Claus was watching, you know, like during Christmas time, of course.
Only during Christmas time.
Yeah, I know.
Between Thanksgiving and New Year's Eve.
Yeah, like I never was told Santa was watching in the middle of July. Like, that never happened. But, you know, we still carry on this tradition to a certain extent in Western society with you know, with Santa Claus. I'm sure with plenty of other things. Leave a comment for ways that we still use fantasy or still use mythology, I guess, in our everyday lives here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's it for us right now.
Yeah. I mean, I did want to mention one last thing. I think the way that one of the ways that makes the mythology sort of magical for us, or modern fantasy. I love when authors do this. J.R.R. Tolkien, we know that was a fictional world, but he was always adamant in letting us know that he was writing this as a sort of fictional or alternate history for England, and which sort of brings in a lot of Northwestern Europe as a whole as well. And a lot of times people would ask, like, where did you get the idea of this? And he's like, or what does this mean? And he'll be like, you know what? I'll have to ask. I'm not sure. Almost like it was given to him. He wrote the book to sort of be like he was transcribing from something they called the Red Book of Westmarch. And so you're supposed to think the whole time that this is actually just Tolkien having translated this book that he found. Of course, no one has found, as far as I know, the Red Book of Westmarch. Like, to be able to say that, hey, you know, this really is a real thing, a real mythology that you took this from. But he made it so that way we can. That's where the magic comes in. It's like,
awesome. Did
he or did he not? Yeah. Like, you know, like, is this completely made up, or did he really actually translate that? He does. Yeah. He's such a good philologist and linguist that he created these languages and these cultures to make it seem very realistic. You know, I feel like if in 100 years, or you know, a few 100 years, and everything has been destroyed, and we're in a post-apocalyptic world, and someone came across Lord of the Rings, they might be able to think this was a mythology.
This was extensive.
Yeah, they're like, wow, like, this is a history, you know, because that was he wanted to be feel more like a history, and less like and that's the sign of a really good fantasy writer, is when they can make it seem like it really is a myth.
Yeah,
so
that's awesome. Well, thank you so much for watching, everyone. Now, leave a comment about maybe other things you might think the difference between mythology and fantasy are. And remember, it's not what you watch, but how you watch it that makes you a scholar.